Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's edition of HR Mentorship Learning Series. My name is Oluyemi Adeosho, and tonight we'll be looking at the topic Protecting Employee Data, Compliance under the NDPA 2023 and GAID 2025. Our facilitator for this evening is Ijeoma Ucheibe. I've been chasing her. Well, I used to chase her like 2-3 years ago. You know, when somebody is proving hard to get, what do? You gotta start praying to God. One day God touched her heart, and by herself, she now became available to the glory of God and to the service and blessings of humanity. So I like to encourage anybody, if you are chasing any dream, be it a career dream or a woman, in my case, don't worry. Don't give up. One day, that dream will chase you. Her name is Ijeoma, and I'm going to read her profile. Please pay attention as I read. But before I go ahead to read her brief profile, feel free to reach out to your colleagues, professional HR associates. They should be on this call. You get why? I don't want anybody to go to prison. I don't have that ministry of prison visitation, for example. This is my 2 cents. All right. Ijeoma is a lawyer, people and culture specialist, and a strategic business leader with over a decade of experience building high-performing organizations across Nigeria. She's the senior consultant people strategy at IU Advisory Services. She helps business translate vision into reality through customized HR advisory, employment law, compliance, business consulting, and strategic training solutions. Ijeoma is also the creator of the Naija HR Chic Series and host of the Naija HR Chic podcast, where she bridges the gap between HR best practice, Nigerian employment law, and practical business strategy. She holds a certification from the Chartered Institute of Personnel Management of Nigeria, CIPN, and the SHRM certifications. She has served on multiple executive council, including the Nigerian Bar Association on Business Law and the Association of Law Firm Administrators of Nigeria. She's a resourceful leader, literary curator. Ijeoma is known for putting employees first because their success drives organizational success. I'm excited, elated, delighted to present to us the delectable, the beautiful, the fashionista, Ijeoma Ucheibe, as she'll be speaking to us this evening on the topic, Protecting Employee Data, Compliance under the NDPA 2023 GAID 2025. Welcome. And over to you, my sister.
Thank you so much, Prof. I always call you for this opportunity to discuss this very important topic. My apologies for not coming on board before now, but we're going to get right into it. And I'll be speaking on today's topic, which is protecting employee data, compliance under the NDPA 2023 and GAID 2025. Please kindly confirm we can all hear me and we can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. Trying to move my slide, but 21 slides. The beauty of why this topic is very, very important for us now more than ever before. Now, I know that every one of us here has heard of data privacy or data protection, and before it used to be assumed that it was an IT function. But thanks to the NDPA, which is the law that I'm going to be referring to in the course of today's webinar, it has become a HR compliance function. That is why we need to insist on the importance and why no one should play around with it. I'm going to talk briefly about someone who I helped to pay 10 million naira to NDPC today because of this issue that a lot of people may have been taken for granted only because they didn't file the CAR. I will speak on that later on in the webinar. Now, why are we talking about data privacy and why do we need to protect employee data in today's world? Number one, like I said, it has evolved to become a very strict compliance function for HR teams. Number two, we have to make sure that whatever we are doing with employee information or data, it must be adherent to the laws on data protection. Number three, data protection is no longer optional. It's not something that you play around with. It's something as simple as even in the forms that you're giving employees to fill now. But it's now a very important and critical compliance function. And lastly, over time, you can see that this would foster trust and strengthen relationships in the workforce. So now we are going to be looking at the NDPA 2023 and the GAID of 2025. These two documents are going to govern what we do with employee data and data in general. But the NDPA, which is the legal foundation for data protection in Nigeria, is the primary legislation that governs the processing of personal data. And in time, we're going to see that it helps to define concepts like who a data controller is and who a data processor is. Now, on the other hand, the General Application and Implementation Directive for 2025 is the manual, is the operational manual that will help you to implement what the law has said in the NDPA of 2023. And it gives you a detailed guidance, and this is what you need to do from step one to step two. And I know that it's not more than 70 pages, but whether we like it or not, at some point we need to find time to read this to ensure that we understand it as HR professionals and then we're able to move for compliance within different organizations. Now, the key takeaway for me for today is we want to be able to master both of these documents so that we can guide compliance. Because if you don't even understand this, you can't even have a conversation with management on the importance of data protection. Now, who is who? We've been talking about data controller, we're talking about the data processor. Who is the data controller? And that is where our primary role comes in. Because, of course, we are the ones that determine the how and why of what we do with employee information. We're the one that control collection of this information. We're the one that process what is going to be done with this site. So we put the purposes for each of these collections. So if we're collecting data for information, maybe at the point of recruitment, we know what we're doing with that data. We're collecting CVs. We are collecting information when people are onboarded into the company. But it's also beholds on you, who is the controller, to implement security measures and access controls so that at the end of the day, you are not held responsible for something that could have been taken care of at the beginning. Now, what are the examples of you controlling data that we're looking about? Payroll systems. So, as much as possible, beyond just recruitment, when these people come on board as employees, you have their data in your payroll. You have their data in performance management. You have their data in for organizations that use HRS software. You have it in there. Now, we're looking at the data processor, and that is where vendors who we work with come into play. Now, external vendors help to process this data, and that is where people like your HMOs, seamless HR, who are like HRIS vendors, payroll service providers, especially if you use external consultants, this is where it becomes handy for them to know their definition under this act. So because they process data on behalf of the organization, they're required to do this processing according to the instructions of the HR team or the HR manager or the HR director, whoever is in charge of this data and this time. And then they are required to also, on their end, implement certain measures that make sure that compliance they had had to in processing or using this data on behalf of the organization in this instance. Now, there are 6 principles that we look at. Sorry, please note this open. There are 6 principles we look at when we are looking at how data is processed for employees. Sorry, someone is talking in the background. And I'm going to talk through them. The first one is lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. Now, the first thing we're going to look at under the Schedule 1 of NDPA, it requires that whatever you are doing with any data you have collected, you are doing it lawfully, you're doing it fairly, and you're doing it transparently in relation to the data subject. The data subject in this case is the employee. And I'm going to give us a little example, which is if you're collecting this data, for instance, does the employee know what this data is about? Do they know what you're doing with it? And more importantly, have they consented? Or better still, is there a legal basis connection of this data? The second principle that governs lawful processing is specified, explicit, and legitimate purpose. What are you collecting this data for? And even when this data is collected, is there a measure being put in place that it is not processed in a manner that is not compatible with why this data is collected? So now, if you're saying that you're collecting data for payroll, and then months later you're using it to market a survey for maybe its HM, you collected this data for payment of their payroll, and then you're using that email address, for instance, to start sending them surveys, we can see that the specified purpose that that data was provided for is now being used for another thing else. Data minimization, as much as possible, that data you've collected, let's try and limit it to what is necessary. So if you're collecting that data for processing of the HMO access to, let it be used for that moment. Collect what you need. And I see this happen a lot of times where people just, you see the people asking for questions around your ethnic group, and I'm asking myself, why do you need to know even people? Why do you need to know sometimes where the local government are from? You don't need that data, especially if you're talking about things that are as personal as the HMO. Please hold on, let me get. Everyone has spoken. So I was talking about data minimization. Data must be limited to what we are collecting it for. And then the first principle is every step you take should be to make sure that whatever data you're collecting is accurate. But if in the event you collect the data that you find inaccurate or doesn't serve the purpose, please delete, erase or rectify without delay. Now, I'm going to drill in on that data minimization because sometimes we need to insist on these things, especially when I'm talking about this specified part of the principle. It means that if you're collecting an employee data for salary processing, let it be for salary, let it be for payment of bonuses, let it be for performance management, not for unrelated activities. I want to put that there to stress the importance. Now, the next one is the what are the pillars that we can base the lawful collection of data? Number one, according to Article 21 of the NDPA Act, when you are serving someone a letter, maybe an employment contract, it is a legal basis for processing of that person's data because as much as possible, we can have the conversation for coming on board an organization, but we need to have this documented, and that is why that performance of contract in the form of an employment contract serves as a legal basis for you to get certain data, especially when it comes to the retirement savings account data or even their salary or account details. Now, the second one we're looking at is the legal obligation. Are there times that you need to collect data because you need to comply with legal mandates? Yes. We all know that there's a new tax. So by default, we know that we are going to pay taxes for staff. We are going to pay a portion of the pensions to PFAs. So by default, we know that under these relevant tax laws and pension laws, we are required to get employee data to fulfill this mandate. The third one is consent. Now, this comes in when we needed to process, maybe we are going on a trip or going on a retreat. While it's important, you need to be sure that whatever consent you're getting for use of this data is freely given, it is specific, and it is informed. I'm going to explain what that means in the next slide. After this first principle. So the last one is where you are handling sensitive personal data. And I know that there was a time where I think I was even the person in question, where I knew that I didn't go to work one day, and I found out that my employer at the time sent an email through the HMO to my hospital asking for very confidential medical records. And I'm thinking to myself that, okay, usually when you come back from being ill and not being able to attend work, you are supposed to bring the doctor's report. What do you need my lab result for? Is it to confirm that indeed, when I said I had malaria, I wasn't lying? So we need to be careful about handling sensitive personal data because health records are really data that fall under sensitive categories. You don't have any business asking for an employee's medical information or the data from iFitness, for instance, or their health conditions, except it is part of your onboarding process. For some organizations, they have a pre-employment medical check portion, which is fine. But other than that, the next category we're going to be looking at is biometric data. So for all of us are always thinking, oh, it's just you're using it to grant access control, you're using it to check attendance for this employee. I'm about to shock you in the next couple of slides why you may not need to rethink whether you need to get people's biometric data in today's age of data protection. And then facial recognition data of our phone. I had talked about the ethnic and religious origin. Information that is revealing of someone's religious belief, the person is Jehovah's Witness, the person is some worshippers, or whether they're Igbo or the fact really not necessary to be collected. It's very sensitive, and we know that. Now, in handling this sensitive data, there are times that yes, it will become necessary by virtue of employment laws, right? To get these people together. And that is where this explicit consent I was talking about becomes necessary. It has to be freely given. It has to be specific and informed. So the data subject who is the employee knows that this is what my data is going to be used for. It has to be unambiguous. It must be clear. They know that this is what this data is for. And then more importantly, it is documented. I'm one for documentation. I'm always hitting the nail on the head when I talk about documentation because sometimes we get bumped one too many times by employees. So you need something to also protect yourself, which is why you need to be sure that whatever consent you're getting to handle certain sensitive personal data of employees, these 3 or 4 examples of explicit consent must have been put in place. And then this falls under the necessity function. Maybe you really need that particular person's data, but it has become necessary to get it. And that is where this explicit consent becomes very important. Now, we notice that there are certain organizations that use biometric data because you don't want people to be signing the names of finance. And you don't realize that even when getting this biometric data that is good, is supposed to be used for whatever purpose you're using it for, you might find yourself getting sensitive biometric data. There was a time that we were trying to introduce this fingerprinting for attendance. And I've worked in a couple of law firms, and we know lawyers can be very wonderful. They went round. Oh, you're supposed to explain it to me. What are you doing with my data? And I'm thinking to myself, I just need the data to be able to capture access control and the attendance so that at least I have my attendance record sorted out by this software. But over time, after reading what the Act says and even the directive 2025, I now saw that there's a high risk that is inherent in this data that we're collecting from these employees. And they do have the right to actually ask, why do you need to have my fingerprint? So even if you must, you need to be sure that as much as possible, like I stated, the consent is explicit. It's not I overheard them say, so they are okay with it. So that's why I moved on. No, you need to avoid that risk. That if you're using the fingerprints, because you're tracking time, you're using the facial recognition for monitoring of attendance, or you're also using it to access and control access of staff, there's a high risk here and it needs to be studied. And then maybe you work for somewhere, an organization like MTN, to make sure that okay, you're trying to get people to confirm that whatever information they're going to give their call center representative is being recorded. There's also that voice recognition tools. What's the guarantee that a deep fake video will not be made and this data that I am providing? One of like the one of the most misunderstood requirements of the NDPA or the DPO, or like I like to call it, is so if your organization is classified as a DCPMI, which I would also define in the next slide, you are required. So it's no longer a matter of optional. It's very mandatory for you to have a DPO. And this DPO must report directly, like I stated there, to the highest level of management. If it's a board of directors, that's who the DPO is required to report to. And why do we need this? Because the DPO, as much as possible, according to Article 12, ensures that he is independent or she is independent in making sure that their duties are fulfilled. Because, for instance, if this DPO is reporting to the head of HR and the head of HR in question is violating data protection laws, can we see the conflict of interest that I'm talking about here? So, what the article does is to ensure that the DPO has the authority to do their job. So, if your DPO asks you to audit your recruitment process, it might be quite difficult, but you need to give them access, period. That's what it means. Now, internal compliance monitor. What this means is they're the ones that will ensure that your organization are keeping to the rules and regulations as we have seen in those two documents that I have referenced. That they are your in-house go-to person when it comes to data protection. And then for HR collaboration, this is the relationship I want everyone to understand. The DPO is not your enemy. You have to work together because if you're implementing a new software or HRIS, for instance, is that DPO that will help you to conduct the data privacy impact assessment. So if you're drafting a data processing agreement with a vendor, for instance, is that DPO that will help you to review it. So it is a joint responsibility. We're going to go over to the next slide where we talk about the EDPIN, which is a data controller or processor. Now we notice that I define the data controller as this major function as HR teams or HR directors, and then the processor is where your vendors come in of major importance. And this is covered under Article 5 of GAID 2025. So who is a DCPMI? You are a DCPMI if you meet any of these criteria. Sometimes I've always gotten this question where they feel you have to meet all four. No, if you meet just one, is enough. Number one, you process data of 1,000 data subjects. Now you're thinking to yourself, I'm not sure we are up to 100, but check the data you're collecting from people who you are trying to put into the organization, the data you're collecting from staff when you are trying to process salary payments, the data you are collecting when you are trying to process HMOs, a lot of data you are collecting from different members of staff who may not necessarily be members of staff, they might even be contract staff or independent contractors. But as long as you're collecting data from them, they form part of your data subject. And once you're processing data of 1,000 and more during the course of the year, you are a DCPM. If you have an annual turnover of 100 million or more, as long as you're hitting that threshold, you are a DCPMI. If you process sensitive data at scale, and this is where HR banks come in the question. That means if you're doing this for a lot of people, you qualify to be a DCPMI. And then if you have data, so if people will say, oh, we have offices across the world, as long as you are processing data of that expatriate that is coming to Nigeria, you qualify to be a DCPMI. Now, what I want us to understand is it's not necessarily the volume. Because here's the thing. If you fall under any of these criteria and you don't register, an NDPC comes knocking, because the least fine they will get from you is 10 million naira. You are in violation from day one, and I'm not sure we want that. So, as much as possible, if you meet any of these criteria, please register with the NDPC. Don't wait. And I stated that most HR departments qualify as DCPMS due to employee. If you're still feeling like you're not sure, you err on the side of caution, just go and register. Now, registration and compliance audit returns. Now that you have registered as a DCPMI with NDPC, what is the next step that you're required to do? Given the volume of data that you are handling as a HR manager or even a team, you are most certainly going to meet this threshold. And it requires that after registration, you are telling NDPC that you are taking compliance seriously. So the one thing that has a strict deadline, which is stated there, March 31st every year, is the CAR, which is the compliance audit returns. You can't come and say, I'm not sure that this is important. It is extremely important. If you haven't started, you need to mark it on your calendar right now. Now, what goes into the CAR? Number one, because it is something that is filed annually, HR is responsible for compiling the employee data section. So this is where we talk about the data that you have collected, why you collected it, where you stored the data, how long you're keeping it, what data privacy impact assessment you have conducted, and then any breaches that have happened in the course of the year. In essence, this is your annual compliance report card to tell NDPC that you have been compliant and you are demonstrating good fit with their laws. Now, the thing is, it is always advised to start early, at least 3 months, because of the deadline, which is 31st of March. But if you wait until March to start preparing your CAR, you're going to have not necessarily a bad time, a hard time, because there's a lot of things you need to be collecting. you are implementing internal controls. There's a training aspect of the act. You're coordinating with IT, you are coordinating with legal to make sure that there are no gaps. And believe me or not, HR and employees, everyone is acting busy. We don't want to waste time trying to pursue people, and then by the time March 31st comes around, you are caught in the middle. So, because if NDPC audits this, your CAR, and then they find omissions, not necessarily because it is your fault, you're going to be fined. You're going to have to pay penalties. So, what this means is if you have not filed your CAR as we speak for 2025, it is overdue. But we can always step into help at IU Advisory Services. But if March 31st, which is 2026, is already coming up this year, that's less than 2 months. We need to start working on those CARs as soon as possible. Now, vendor management, which is where sometimes it gets a bit tricky because we just take it for granted that since we have an SLA with these vendors, why do we need a separate agreement? Now more than ever before, according to relevant sections of the NDPA and Article 34 of GAID, it is crystal clear. As long as anybody is processing data on your behalf as an organization, you need a data processing agreement standard. What this does is to protect the organization, and then it binds vendors to protect employee data. So that if there's any breach in the course of your working with this vendor, you are covered. And most of the vendors that this covers is payroll service providers, HMOs, cloud-based HRS vendors like Seamless HR and all those other ones. And now let's talk about what goes into the DPA. If we look at the right-hand side of my slide, the first thing is the scope of the DPA and what is the purpose for it. Now, the first question, what data are they processing on behalf of the organization? The next thing is the duration of processing that data. How long is this agreement valid? Is it a year? Is it a 6 month contract? Is it a 3 month contract? What are they doing to protect that data? What are the measures they are putting in place to make sure that this data is protected? Sub-processing restrictions. And they subcontract to another app? If so, under what conditions can you place for them to do that? So let's just say they have a HMO, for instance, before that they used to now print all those cards that you would take to hospitals to access care before they started making it online, right? Who are those people that they are working with to produce those cards? Those are now subcontractors to the HMOs. And under what conditions is what this TPA is going to cover? Now, they are also required to notify you if there's any breach. Maybe there's a hack or for some any reason that data is violated or exposed. They're supposed to let you know within 24 hours in time. And in a few slides, I'm going to explain to us why that timeline is very, very key. So if they discover that there's been a breach, they are required to inform you in 24 hours so that you have time to also notify NDPC within the 72-hour window. This is also to protect you as well. And then they are also required to delete or return all employee data. So this idea that HMOs that when they are coming to renew the HMO contract with you, they just assume naturally. But thanks to this DPA, it helps to protect the company and the organization because you are stating clearly after 1 year, we are entering into another agreement where you state clearly that this other data that we have provided for you, whether or not we are recycling the same people, must be deleted upon termination if we are not renewing our contract with you. And then the audit right. You have a right to also audit to make sure that they comply, regardless of whether they are vendors. And then lastly, who is on the hook if anything goes wrong? This is where the organization and the organization is covered under liability and indemnity provisions. Sorry, I'm speaking a lot of law today. Now, the data privacy impact assessment that I have been talking about. This is the most important tool you can have for proactive compliance. So instead of waiting for the CAR that will be done on March 31st, you can start by making sure that anything that you need to do, any processing of data that needs to happen with data subject does not result in a high risk or breach. So what is a DPIA? It is a critical assessment, a critical tool, like I said, for proactive compliance that lets you know that before you take or do any data processing activity, you have to think about it like a risk management or assessment for employee privacy. But you cannot do this alone. That is where the TPO comes in. You have to make sure that as much as possible as a HR professional, you are involving the GPO in conducting these assessments. That way you're able to identify and mitigate potential or identified privacy risks. And then looking at when to conduct a DPIA. Number one, when you want to implement the biometric attendance system, for instance, this is the first thing that you're required to do. You are deploying an AI powered, like you see that there's a lot of AI powered recruitment tools. I've been fortunate to use one or two of them. There should have been a TPIA being conducted internally and externally to also protect the candidate so that it doesn't just feel like because you're using it internally, that's the only person you should be thinking about. But you have to do that even when you're doing a AI powered tool that you'll be using with external candidates as well. When you are processing health data for health insurance, it could be health insurance, it could be group life insurance, for instance, you are required to conduct this assessment. If you're conducting a huge data transfer between offices, maybe your offices are located around the world, you're required to have this done. And then generally, if you're having a large scale monitoring, maybe there's a survey that is being done, this data privacy impact assessment is necessary to be done. Now, looking at the DPIE, how do you go about it? Number one, you have to assess if this processing is necessary for obligations that you are fulfilling to employees. Is this necessary? Can you achieve this goal of getting people's data with less invasive methods? That's the first one. Second thing is, what is the impact? What is the impact on employee? What is the impact on their privacy? Are there any risks of data breach? Will somebody be able to have unauthorized access? Will there be any form of discrimination or bias from getting that data? Third thing is you have to have that conversation with your DPO, like I keep talking. You have to have that conversation with your IT security or your IT administrator. And if possible, talk to the affected employees. This is what we are doing with this data. So as much as possible, I know that it feels like Ijeoma is scaring every one of us. It's making it look like anything you want to take from employees, you need to ask. Yes, it has become very, very important. And why do you need to do this? Because at the end of the day, the last step there is you are documenting everything. I cannot stress how important this is because the outcome of this DPIA goes into your annual CAR, the compliance audit returns I was talking about. If you recall, I kept talking about what have you done with people's data? What did you do? If there's any breach, what step did you take? So this helps to reduce the number of months and possibly people you need to bring on board to make sure that the CAR is ready on or before the 31st of March. Now, the key call out for me, as we can see on the bottom of this slide, is they are a mandatory component of your submission for the CAR. So that if NDPC is auditing you and is asking you, so where are your DPIs for the biometric you introduced or that processing that you did for their health information for that insurance, and you don't have one, that's this problem, people. That's a real huge risk you don't want to take. So as much as possible, now more than ever before, this is the time to look at processing of data activities and conduct DPIs if you haven't done them already. Now, going over to the next slide, I'm going to try and run through the slides. Easy training and sensitization, I call it STOP, which means schedule for internal sensitization and training on privacy. So I've been talking so much about HR teams, and yes, we are one of the target groups, but as much as possible, we don't want to just restrict it to the HR staff or administrators. We're also looking at making sure that recruitment personnel or people who are in charge of this, even if they are vendors, are trained on how to handle employee data. If you're a manager who has access to employee data through performance management, you are the target group for this. Now, the compliance work that we're talking about, it does not mean anything if we don't even understand our responsibilities, which is why this top requirement is a non-negotiable. Annually, you must have this training. It's a sensitization training, it's a refresher training to make sure that every employee is aware of their data protection obligation. You have to train your people. Who needs training? I have listed them out. Now, I don't expect everyone to become a data protection expert. It's not realistic because at the end of the day, between trying to recruit staff, trying to make sure that everyone is doing what they need to do as a HR professional, but you need a basic privacy checklist or BPC, like I call it. What that does is it helps you to simplify compliance into basic action steps. So before you collect data, what is the purpose? Why am I asking for this data? Do I require this consent from this employee? If it is yes, you need to get it properly. It has to be freely given. It is not ambiguous. They are not being forced to give you that consent. Am I collecting what is necessary? If we realize I talked about data minimization, don't go and collect HMO data and now use it for surveys. And then do we have security measures in place to make sure that if we collect this data, we have stored it in a protected folder? And then how long are we keeping this data, for instance? So these are things that should go into the basic privacy checklist. Laminate it, if possible, put it on your desk, put it on your CEO's desk. But as much as possible, this will help us to evolve and change our systems over time. So if you haven't done your stock training, please schedule it and I can help to do that for you if it's something that you have never done before. Now, going over to the employee consents and common mistakes that we make when it comes to this consent. This slide right here. I wish I could just screenshot it and then send it to every HR professional in Nigeria because I'm going to talk about what is not valid consent and what is valid consent. Number one, you have sent me a 50-page contract, and then on page 36, paragraph 16, you put a clause there and say, oh, I consent to the processing of my personal data. Nope, that's not valid consent. Because this person is in that mode where he wants to just sign the letter and get it over and done with. Trust me, he doesn't quite understand that this is what they need to do to move on to the next. So you're almost saying that because it was buried somewhere and the person has now signed the employment letter by default, he has given you consent to access or use their data. No, it is not freely given. Now, we have seen this happening a lot of times where you register for something like you give your email and then you think that because, oh, this person has opted out. Check here if you do not want your data to be used, if you don't want to be photographed, and then you now think that because the person has clicked the opt-in option, that means by default the person has consented. Nope, that is not consent. That is not valid consent. And then the next one we're looking at is where you say or you hear situations and you see a lot of these things happen on LinkedIn every other day. Oh, you have to sign this form or sign this applicant form or else you cannot be hired. You're not questioning that, you're not asking for this person's consent. That almost borders on the edge of coercion. It's almost like if you don't do this, this is not going to happen. And if consent is not valid, that is not a condition of employment. So you cannot tell someone sign this or you cannot be hired, for instance. And then the popular one that everyone uses, which is that I agree to all data processing, is too vague. Like I always indicate, consent has to be specific to each purpose. Now, let's look at what is valid consent. Number one, it has to be a standalone document. It is not buried in a contract that I refer to. It is a separate form that says we would like to use your photo, for instance, on the company website, or we are trying to work on a poster that we are putting on our social media platforms. Do you consent? Yes or no? There is no maybe, or let us know what time. No, 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 no. Do you consent? Yes or no? If a person says no, you are obliged not to do that. And I know that a lot of studios even do that these days. When they take pictures of you, they ask you for your consent if you want it to go on their social media platforms. Now, the second one is it has to be specific. You cannot be collecting data from newsletter and they are also using that same data for tracking performance of that staff. It doesn't make sense. So you can't be saying a consent to receiving the company article on privacy, for instance, and then now think that you can lump the two of them together. They have to be specific. If you're getting consent for newsletters, let it be used for that purpose. Don't use it for performance tracking. And then I have insisted and I've harped on this a lot of times. This consent has to be freely given. So that means the employee, and I'm sure that we don't want to hear this part, can decline. And is not required to give me reasons or start thinking about how to punish that employee. Yes, and I know it feels like the NDPA is giving a lot of employees, which we all are by extension, even though we might be occupying different positions as HR professionals. It's giving us a lot of rights and obligations as well under this new act. So the employee is able to say no without any negative cons. You can't go back and start saying, no, I'll wait for you in front. If they decline, they're not penalized, they're not losing opportunities, they're not saying, oh, they won't be promoted. Nothing changes for them. And then the last one, it is easy for them to withdraw. So if a consent is not easy to withdraw, it's no longer a valid consent. It should be very easy for me to say, I'm revoking my consent any time. This one is very key. So an employee can consent today and decide to change their mind next month. And you have to honor that withdrawal, even though it can take you a step back because you're thinking whatever it is that I got that consent for might be a 6 months long project. But my challenge to everyone is go through your consent forms if you have one. If you don't, this is the time to get one done, please. If they are valid and they contain valid consent portions on their document, fantastic. If not, this is the time to fix them. Because if an employee takes you to NDPA and says they forced me, so as much as possible, this is the time to audit your consent processes and then make sure that they meet the standards that is on this slide. Now, the next slide is my second favorite, which is the fact that recruitment requirements as much as possible before an applicant submits their data. They should also see your privacy policy. So I've started saying that sometimes, even for companies that are recruiting, you will see almost like a portion on the form. For those of them that use Google Form, it's almost like explicitly stated, this is what you're using your data for, which is very commendable because not everyone even understands the importance of doing this. So the fact that you even see companies nowadays doing that on Google Forms, even though, of course, it suffices for the time because you don't expect that the candidate would start reading through your privacy policy, but it helps. So that the applicant also sees that this is what we are doing with your data, for instance. And now, what this means is looking at the necessity and proportionality principle, which I will explain. What that means simply is if I need this data for HR manager recruitment, collect that data alone. Don't go and start looking at other data the person might have filled for other positions. Collect that data that you need and move on. Meaning, if it's relevant to the vacancy, if you're hiring a sales rep, for instance, and you need their CV, you need their work history, maybe references. But this idea of, oh, what is your current salary? The last place that you're working, I see that in forms, and everyone on socials knows me. I'm always talking about it, like, what do you need the last salary I was collecting for? If you have a budget for that room, you don't need to be asking me this kind of information or asking me for this kind of data. You don't need to be asking me what my medical history is looking at or if I'm married or not. And when I see forms like that, I just pass. You don't. What do you need my marital status for? So in essence, only collect what you know that you need at the end of the day. And then most importantly, like you keep talking about, even if these people are applicants, we need to still get their consent. So once they've seen the privacy policy, if you're able to post it maybe on your website, or if you're using a form, you put it on that portion or the topmost part of Google Forms, for instance, they are able to know that this is the data you're collecting, why you're collecting it, how long you're keeping it, which is where I'm going to talk about the retention itself, and more importantly, who has access to it. So once they have seen that, they can tell, and then they fill that form. It is a given that that consent is valid, it is informed, because you've told them what you're doing with their data, and then it is freely gotten. Now, this is where, and I think I've made a couple of mistakes here too. A lot of organizations, I wouldn't say we mess up, but maybe because for lack of knowledge, we don't know that you are not supposed to retain data for longer than necessary. You need to be able to have clear limits on how long you can keep certain data, and then you have to regularly check your data to either review or delete. And if there's any need to retain that data, like I stated there, maybe 6 to 12 months for unsuccessful candidates, you will need to justify. So I always ask people, why do we need to get to that point of justifying to an unsuccessful candidate why we kept their CV? Are we hoping that if there's an opening, we are now going to reach out to them maybe after 2 years? Because this happened to me. I applied for a job in 2024 January, and I got a response in January 2026. That was 2 years. I took it for granted that, okay, maybe they don't even know that they're not supposed to retain my data for this long. And I didn't want to make an issue out of it. But imagine if there's an applicant that decides to want to be a lawyer about things and now takes it up with NDPC. You now start asking yourself, oh, but we did not employ you. He's not an employee, he's beefing. It's not beefing you, it's within his data privacy rights. So what I'm trying to say is this portion of recruitment and data retention, whether you're an applicant to or an employee, they have the same DSER rights. I will speak on that shortly. So if we look down, what I did down here was recommended retention periods. If you're keeping an unsuccessful applicant CV, please let it not exceed 12 months. After 12 months, please and please delete it. You don't need to have this thing in your system. Employee personnel files, a duration of, so if they are employed for 10 years, it is required that you can only keep that document or their data on file for 6 years. So whoever I worked with, for instance, in 2015 should have deleted my data because I have the right to request. And if I request and I find out that you still have my data, that's another biggie. So it is better that I request as a former employee and you don't have it. Yes, you're off to me. But if I request, which is what I found that a few of former employees for where I worked last were asking for certain social media posts of them to be taken down. And it was a bit shocking because I'm like, okay, they are well within their rights because really it's been over 10 years since they worked here. So why do we still have this thing on our social media platforms and they would rather not have it there? But for someone that doesn't understand that this is also their right, you start wondering why is this person asking me to take down his social media post? Because it's a birthday post and they wanted it taken down, but we did comply with that request within the time frame. And then payroll, you can only retain for 6 years because obviously it's a tax law requirement. So at the end of the day, action item for this slide, please, you need to work on your retention schedule. How long can we keep certain data belonging to employees and applicants? document it, and then, if possible, implement a process where you delete this data as soon and frequently as possible. Data subject access request, which is what I was talking about in the former slide, where employees' rights, especially data subject, because that is what the Act refers to them, have 3 rights under the NDPA. Number 1, an employee can just ask for access. What personal data do you have on me? And you have to confirm whether or not you are using their data. Give them access to their data and then give them information about how you are using their data. They are entitled to know. So in case somebody walks into your office and they're asking for a right to confirm what are you even doing with that information that I give you? It is not them asking for something that they should not ask for. They are entitled to know under the NDPA now. And then the second one is a right to rectification. So if an employee says, okay, that address that you have on me that said I was living in Yaba, I've now moved to Surrey, you have to correct it without undue delay. Normally, I even try to implement, like, every year an employee update form where I don't want to assume that whatever information you gave me last year is what you have on file this year. But in the event that you don't do that and they come to tell you that, oh, they have now moved, please correct without delay. You have to verify, investigate to be sure that, okay, this person is not doing this because for whatever reason, and then fix it. Now, the last one is the right to portability. This is a new concept, and what this means is they want a station where they're able to ask you to send them what you have on them. So maybe all the years they've gone to school, they got to start working with the organization as a graduate, and then they've gone to have their masters, their PhD. There's a bulky file of them having information on site. They are able to request for that under the NDPA Act in any file, preferably CSV or even an Excel spreadsheet. So what they're saying to you is, okay, now that I currently work with you and I'm doing this for a school, I'm not able to get my transcript and you have my transcript on file. I want you as my employer to send my transcript to this university. And they have a right to transmit that data under the NDPA Act without hindrance. So what that also means is if they leave your organization, for instance, and they join another organization, it doesn't necessarily have to be a competitor. They can ask for their same data to be shared. So this part is a bit newer, and a lot of organizations are not quite understanding of it because it's a new concept. Because how can you tell me you left my company, you're going to work for another company? Instead of you to give that company the data, you're asking me to transfer the data that I have of you to that company. So, but because it's a right, you are obligated to respond to this. So what this means is we have to have a time-bound process to effectively handle this. And then the standard response time. So let's say this person asks for this data today. Today is the 13th of February. Whatever you are doing by the 13th of March, that data should have been made available to that data subject or that employee. So now, one of the things that I also advocate is creating a procedure, a workflow process. Who are the people who are obligated to receive this DSAR, these requests? Who will verify the employee's identity? Who will locate the data? Who can review it? Who will now be the person to send it? So it might be that the email was sent to you as HR director. You can also delegate that to the HR officer to make sure that they are the ones that will verify and do everything before they send the response. And then training is very, very key. Your HR team needs to know how to handle this request. And more importantly, that they have 30 days. The only time you can extend it to 90 days if it is something that is so complex. And there are layers of approval before that data can now be provided. But looking at the timeline, 30 days should be your standard response time at the most. Please and please. So if you don't have a process in place, that is a gap. So now it's not a question of if you will ever receive a request like this, it's a question of when. So if you haven't started documenting your DSAR process, this is the time to get your team to start working on it and then test it. Now, going to the next slide, I'm just going to rush through this. This is the critical 72-hour breach window. This is the slide that should scare a lot of us because, as much as possible, you see that red banner on the top. There's a time critical requirement, which is the fact that data controllers, which is HR teams, must notify the NDPC within 72 hours of becoming aware of a data breach. You can't say, oh, because it's a Friday, let me wait till Monday. No, 3 days, 72 hours. It did not say working days, 3 days. So what it means is, let me paint a scenario. Looking at Friday, we're about to close for the weekend. Somebody from IT now says, oh, we've just discovered that somebody sent a phishing email to staff and then was able to access the database. Or let's say even came from the DPO, for instance. Now, what this means is you have less than 24 hours to notify NDPC. Note, this person accessed the database of the employees 2 days ago. So you are thinking to yourself, but I was just informed today. No, it doesn't matter because the clock started ticking. And that's why I put 0 hour to 4 hour for you to see. The clock started ticking when they discovered it, which was Wednesday, not when you found out about it on Friday. So now the first question you're asking to yourself, do you have a plan? Who do you call? Do you know what information itself that the NDPC needs? Now, looking at the timeline, it means 0 hour is when the breach was discovered. 24 hours, you should already be trying to contain that data breach. By 48 hours, you should already be drafting an email notifying the NDPC. And then by 72 hours, which you ordinarily not meet you there, you should have. Because if you miss that 72-hour window, you're in violation. Penalties will apply. Now, the first thing, what is your response as HR? You need to provide details about the affected data subject. How many employees were accessed? What was the data in question that was compromised? Then, what have the steps that you've already taken to make sure that this breach is being taken care of? Have you coordinated with IT? Have you coordinated with the lawyers or the legal team? And more importantly, is the DPO in the know? All this is geared towards letting the NDPC know that you have taken necessary steps before notifying them as well. And what is going to form part of this documentation is what is the details like of the breach, like I said, what was compromised, how many people were affected, what is the timeline of the event, what has been the actions that were taken, what are the measures that have been implemented right before. Now, what do you count as a breach? Unauthorized access, someone who should not have access normally gets it. So you can take it for granted that, okay, maybe the IT person was doing something at home, was working from home, and then for some odd reason, his son has access to his laptop. That is a breach, whether or not it was intended. That child, even though it is his child, does not have access. It does not have authorized access, and that counts as a breach. So all of us, I love them. I know that we love our children, but we need also to be careful when we have data belonging to employees on our phones. Like we have a lot of emails now being on phones. It's very, very important. Let's say accidentally, I did this one time. I sent an email to a wrong recipient. So I was supposed to send the email to staff. I sent the email not just to staff, I also copied the HR. And I don't know what happened that day. I think I was sleepy or tired. It was even after I go home, I realized it, I think 4 hours later. Guys, you needed to see the speed with which I used to send an email to staff, apologizing for everything I did. This was even years before NDPA Act came into effect, I think 2020 or 2021 or thereabout. You would think that someone had gone to my head, but this was even before the Act came into play, and I made sure that, okay, I sent an email to the wrong recipient, but this is what I did immediately to curtail that breach. And the last one is the loss of data, where you have a laptop that was stolen. You are also required to inform NDPC. I'm not really necessarily going to give them too much information about what is in the laptop, right? But you need to let them know that this has happened. Now, All these count as breach, and all of them are able to trigger the 72-hour window. Action item from this thing is, what is your incident response plan? As we speak now, as you're listening to me, what is on that plan? Who is your response team? If something like that happens as we are speaking, what is the protocol? Have you tested it? Have you done a drill? Because when something like that does happen, which I don't pray it does happen, you will not have time to figure it out. Which brings me to the next slide, where I talk about the compliance action plan. Finish off today's webinar. So we've covered a lot, and I've been talking quite a bit, and your head is spinning like, oh my God, there's a lot of DPIA, there's a lot of DCPII, there's a lot of DPO, there's a lot of words to cram and think about. But the first thing I always try to do is, I'll give you a roadmap. I'm not going to talk, but I'll give you a roadmap to say, okay, this will break down your compliance action plan going forward. So that by December 2026, for instance, against 2027, you're already ready. So the first thing is, by now, if you haven't done it, you need to determine if your organization qualifies as a DCPMI. Now, we noted that I talked about 4 criteria. So any one of them can qualify you as one. And then, secondly, by week 1, you should need to have verified that your DPO reports directly to the board, not HR director or HR manager or IT manager or VP or CEO, to the board. There's a reason why. You get why. And then determine if there's a lot of mapping that has been done. Okay, we have employee data in different boxes. Where did we keep it? Is it on OneDrive? Is it stored in a special place? Why did we collect it? Do we have a legal basis for even processing this thing? This is where the DPIA that I was talking about, data protection impact assessment, comes into play. Now, did we store it in a filing cabinet? Maybe it's a documented data. Is it in a USB drive? Is it safe? In essence, map it. Let's know what you've collected, why you've collected it, what's the legal basis, and the retention period. The retention period, that is very key. By month 1, you are sure that whoever you're working with externally, a vendor, anybody, they all have updated data processing agreements in place as we mandated under the Act. There is no story of, oh, we put it as a clause in the SLA. It no longer applies like that. So ensure that all your vendors have updated DPS as mandated. So this is the time to pull out all your contracts. That contract I had with that consultant, that contract I have with that HRIS vendor, with HMO, DPA. If you don't have them, this is the time to draft them. Please, guys, it's very, very important. Month 2, which is January, typically, if you started in December, for instance, this is the time to have started your training. If you have not started, you need to enhance your stop, which is what I talked about, which is schedule for internal sensitization and training. It is an annual requirement. So it's not like when you've done it this year, it has crossed the box or you've checked the box. It is required for you to do this for everybody in the organization, recruitment, personnel, managers, HR team, or everyone. And then development of your basic privacy checklist. So what this means is, whether you like it or not, and see that you have started preparation for your compliance audit returns. Don't wait until March. As much as possible, begin 3 months before the deadline. 3 months, and that is why I was referring to us starting in December. So if your deadline is March 31st, it means that whatever you are doing by January, you ought to have started. So it's not too late. And that's why we are here to help you at IU Advisory. But the final thing is, even as you're conducting these DPIAs, for instance, it is needed for biometrics. It is needed if you're deploying anything that requires processing of employee data on a large scale. Now, compliance is not a one-time project. It's ongoing, which is the beauty of what I like with what the Act and the operational manual, which is GAID, has done. So, but if you follow this roadmap the way it is stated here, I'm sure we can all get to a point where we have a solid foundation. When it's time to present our compliance report card, I am very optimistic that every one of us on this call is going to be compliant. Now, the last slide, I made references to where we can get this document, which is at www.ndpc.gov//resources, and then how we can get started by registering for this. And then if you need help, this is what we can help you do. And I know that this is very, very overwhelming. All of us on this call, we're juggling a lot of things. I know that Doctor even had to send reminders, a couple of things to get everyone. And now I'm asking you to become a data protection expert on top of it. There's a point of view that is looking at it from like, HR is going to be everything by the end of this year. But you don't have to do this alone. And that is why you need a DPO. And I didn't tell Doc about this, but I'm going to be sharing a HR data protection checklist with everyone who joined this call today so that it will help you to just look at what you need to do and have not done so far. And this is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time. I'm going to open it up for Q&A. Doc.
Thank you so much. That was an excellent session, excellent presentation. Do you have any questions, comments, or contributions, ladies and gentlemen? I know today is Friday, and some people want to go out, including our facilitator. That's on a lighter note anyway. Any comments, any questions, any contributions quickly? Okay. I think tonight I would like to do the honors of appreciation. Barrister, I'd like to thank you most sincerely for taking time out of your busy schedule to do this session with us and for us this evening. This has been eye-opening, enlightening, and on behalf of all of us, a significant part of one which you are also part of us, I'd like to say thank you this evening for doing justice to this. Don't worry, we will keep your little data that you have with us, we'll keep it safer. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Thank you for the honor.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night, sir.